Hi, it's Anna Mason, and in this watercolour tip video I wanted to show you how I went about painting these shiny, juicy cherries. Specifically, I wanted to focus in on how you create the transitions between the highlights and the dark skin of the cherry around them, because getting this right really gives them their realism. I used a photo as my reference, and I began by creating a drawing where I not only outlined the outside edge of the cherry, but also the edges of the shiny highlights with a jagged pencil mark to mark the texture on that transition from the highlight into the darker flesh around them. Then I laid down a really pale wash to the highlight areas using a watery grey mix to match to the lightest possible tones I could see in the highlights. Next, I added a little crimson to the watery grey mix to apply a layer to the patches of highlight which have a more pink hue to them, before going on to apply a very slightly darker mix to all of the rest of the cherry, including all the areas that will end up being much darker. Once that had dried off, I went in with a mix that was a match to the darkest tones I could see in the cherry and applied this around the areas of highlight, making sure I used the tip of the brush to feather the edge of the transition into the highlight colour. I was careful not to apply this mix into any areas that I thought might be lighter in tone. And when that had dried, I worked into the mid-tones of the cherry, which are the areas which were a little bit shiny but not as light as the highlights. For this, I applied a mix that was a milky consistency, much lighter than the dark mix I'd just applied, but not as light as the first wash. I went over the edge of the darkest tones to begin to graduate the transition there a little. I even applied this mix over the patch of highlight to the right-hand side. Next, I used another watery grey mix that was just a little darker and applied it with a smaller brush into areas of the highlight that needed to be a little darker, including along the transition into the darker colour of the cherry skin, blending slightly with my brush. And I also used the tip of my brush to create some texture markings within the highlights. Now the highlights were a little bit darker, I could see that the darkest tones needed to be darkened some more, so I applied another layer of the thicker mix there, making sure not to apply it right up against the highlight, but leave a thin strip through to the lighter layer underneath, to help create a more graduated transition between highlight and skin colour. I then adjusted the semi-shiny areas again with another milky consistency wash to darken them a little. After darkening the cherry some more, I could now tell that my highlights needed darkening some more too, so I went back to the watery grey mix and worked into areas of the highlights, including the transitions, some more. I then added a touch of some crimson to the watery grey mix and worked into the highlights again to darken a fraction and add a bit more texture with my brush. Next, I took a little bit of water on my tiniest brush and I worked into the transitions between highlight and cherry skin colour, and also between darker and lighter greys in the highlights to smooth them. But I didn't try to smooth all the transitions. When I really looked, I could see that some transitions needed a little bit more texture to them, so I added that now with the tiny brush and some thicker paint, creating little dots to add that texture. Then finally, I used some more watery mix to create those dotty textured markings within the highlights too. Then once I'd done the same to the other cherries, the painting was finished. A full step-by-step tutorial of these yummy cherries is available now in my online school. If you've enjoyed this tip video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'd love it if you'd share this video with your friends. And if you'd like to take one of my tried and tested step-by-step tutorials for free, hop on over to annamasonart.com, where you'll find even more resources to help you pick up your brush and paint the way you've always wanted to. Remember, you won't improve your painting unless you make the time to paint, so be sure to schedule in some me time this week and paint something you love. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon for another tip for creating watercolours with wow. Just record that, that can be the intro.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Okay, so you're on the right.